Well, welcome to everybody who's online already. We'll be starting very shortly. We're just waiting for all the participants to come online and then we'll be able to start. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we seem to have stabilised at the moment with participants, although I anticipate others will be joining us fairly shortly. So welcome all to the first in our series of NPA Connections. The title for tonight is New South Wales Marine Parks, Are We Serious About Their Place in the Reserve Network? My name is Graham Douglas. I'm the President of the National Parks Association and I'll be your MC host for this evening. I'll be going through three panellists through the evening. But first, as we start the day, I'd like to acknowledge that we're all in different places across New South Wales and possibly Australia, and that we're on Aboriginal land. And I'd like to acknowledge the Aboriginal elders, past, present and emerging, and recognise that I, and probably all of you, are sitting on Aboriginal land, and it is and always will be Aboriginal land. So thank you all very much. Just a few housekeeping matters that I'd like you to all think about tonight. The webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded to our social media pages later. Attendees' videos and microphones are set to off, and participants are not able to be seen or heard, but you can participate through the Q&A buttons that are at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and at the end by typing your questions into that chat. Now, you should type as we go through the individual sessions. We'll be collating those questions, and then at the end of the presentations, I'll be asking your questions to the panelists. So please use the Q&A sessions and do that as we go through the evening. Now, we would also like and invite people obviously to donate to the NPA so that we can carry on these presentations into the future. You could join as a member if you're not a member already, or you could join as a supporter. And either way would be a really good thing and would help not just marine conservation, but conservation in general. So I'd welcome you all to this session here tonight, and I hope that you all get something out of it. Tonight, I want to introduce our first panellist, which is John Turnbull. We'll talk with him in a moment. We also have Gary Schoer with us, and we have Sharnie Connell with us this evening. Now, John Turnbull is a marine ecologist who has investigated the social ecological outcomes of marine protected areas at the University of New South Wales, and is also Secretary of the New South Wales branch of the Australian Marine Sciences Association. And John's going to be talking to us tonight about the science behind marine protected areas. So I'd like you all to welcome John Turnbull to the screen. And John, thank you very much for joining us this evening.
My pleasure, and thank you, Graham, and welcome all. And in fact, I see some familiar names there in the attendees, so hi, if I know you. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen. I have a short presentation which summarises the current state of marine science regarding marine protected areas, and also uses some of the research that I've personally been involved in. So can you see a slide there of Cabbage Tree Bay? Okay. So yes, this is only a brief presentation, about 10 minutes, when I'll be going through the science of marine protected areas. And I think one of the first questions that immediately comes to mind is, well, do we need marine protected areas? Is the ocean healthy? Is it in trouble? What's the status of the ocean? And that's a big question, which we don't have time to go into details here, but there are a couple of big studies that have answered this, certainly globally and also Australia-wide. Probably the best one to refer to is the 2014 paper in Nature, which is about as highly regarded as you can get, by Graham Edgar and others, where they concluded that the biomass of fish in the world's oceans is down by about 2/3 on historical levels. And sharks in particular, so it's not all species that are affected the same way. Pretty much the biggest species get affected the most, as a general rule. Sharks, which are at the top of the tree, are down by over 90%. So that's there are a lot of reasons for that, but one of the main reasons is extraction of those animals from the ocean by fishing pressure. That's globally. Often we hear in response to that, well, hang on, Australia is not in a bad way. Well, in fact, Australia is not much different. Our biomass of fish in Australian waters has declined by 30% in the last 10 years. So I think we do need to do something about this. We need to tackle this depletion of biomass because you get to a point where those populations are unsustainable and then you get fisheries collapse. So rather than me talk about my personal view, I thought I'd just show you the position of marine scientists in Australia. They recently revamped their position statement. This is available on the AMSA website. Released in December 29. There are a number of bullet points at the very beginning. The first one is MPAs are vital to conservation. So no question amongst marine scientists whether we should have them. They should be designed based on sound scientific principles. Really, unless the MPA is well designed and has an ecological impact, you're wasting your time. There's no point having an MPA that looks good on paper, makes managers feel good, but actually doesn't have an ecological consequence because it's just taking up space. And that means them being comprehensive, adequate and representative. And you can look up those terms and what they mean. The consensus amongst scientists globally and now also acknowledged in Australia is we need at least 30% of the oceans to be in highly protected areas. Basically, let's call them sanctuary zones. If we are to see recovery of biodiversity and biomass, if you have less than that, 20% will pretty much hold you in position, 10% might give you some impacts, but won't allow you to recover. So the 30 by 30 movement, 30% of the oceans protected by 2030 is gaining momentum as a result of a lot of research behind this. And finally, for an MPA to be effective, it's got to be well enforced. It's got to be big, in place for a long time and well located. So in other words, design matters. And if you do that, if you get effective marine protection, there are so many studies on this. I'll just summarize a few. Globally, studies have shown you get twice as many fish and 5 times the biomass. Why more biomass? Because you get more big fish. So the abundance is the count of fish and the biomass is the weight of fish. Fish grow bigger, they reproduce more, and so your biomass goes up. That's a global study, a study that I'm in the midst of publishing at the moment, which was 625 surveys around Southern Australia, pretty much from Port Stephens to Perth. Found that effective marine protected areas, no take zones, have 1.3 times the richness, 2.5 times the biomass, 3.5 times the large fish biomass. And the question of whether or not MPAs spill over into surrounding areas and therefore benefit surrounding fisheries is well addressed in this paper by Di Lorenzo, and the answer is yes, they do. Interestingly, in the research that I did, I interviewed people, 439 people around the Great Southern Reef, and found that 92% of them agreed with having marine reserves which restricted fishing. And the number was virtually no different between people who fished and people who didn't. So it's interesting in terms of this view that these aren't well accepted. If you just go and talk to people, see, the trouble is a lot of these studies don't control their sampling, and so they'll have a web survey. Well, that's going to get hammered by people with particular interests. Whereas if you just go and introduce yourself to people in a coastal setting and interview them, then you get a true sample. And when you sample like that, you get these figures. So one of the statements we're making in the paper, which is currently under review, is that full marine protected areas, sanctuary zones, are well understood, supported and valued by the public, and people perceive them to have better marine life, which is in keeping with their actual results. So not only do they have better marine life, people feel they do. They see better marine life, they experience improvements directly, and so they have this belief, which is in keeping with reality. So let's now look locally. So there was some global and then Southern Australian. So, you know, southern half of Australia, draw a line halfway through Oz and go down. That was the last study. These are now figures from Sydney. Last week we did a webinar, Reef Life Survey did a webinar on Sydney's numbers based on 10 years of data. Basically the green is the sanctuary zones in Sydney, which is pretty much Shiprock and Cabbage Tree Bay. And the yellow is partially protected areas, places like Bronte, Coogee, Narrabeen, those other aquatic reserves. And red is the areas that are outside reserves. You can see pretty much the partially protected areas don't do anything, which is in keeping with the findings of the paper we're currently publishing. The fully protected areas have a big uplift in fish biomass and richness. Now the scale on the biomass is a log scale, so it's a power of 10. So it's not 50% more fish. It's, I don't know, 10 to the power of 1.5, but it's maybe double or 2.5 times the fish biomass. Fish richness on the right-hand side, so more biodiversity in marine protected areas. And you can see it goes up and down a bit. That's because there are cyclical arrivals of tropical species coming down on the East Australian current. So you get these big surges in fish richness in particularly warm years. So we're seeing in these two graphs very clear evidence of two big impacts. One, fishing pressure is suppressing fish populations, and two, warming of our oceans is bringing increasing surges of species down from the East Australian current, from the tropics. And that's also affecting not just fish, but also invertebrates. Generally around Southern Australia, invertebrates are in decline, similar to fish, but some species aren't in decline. And in particular, the barren forming urchin, Centrostephanus rogersi, is increasing in numbers because it's benefiting from having its predators removed. Big lobsters and big snapper and other big fish are the only things that can eat these urchins. We've taken them out of the ocean. And so these urchins are having a party. You can see the general trend for Centrostephanus rogersi. The grey graph is going up over time. That's in Sydney. You can see that is suppressed somewhat by marine protected areas, particularly fully protected areas. In the lower graph, you see there are less urchins in the fully protected areas. That's because there's more big fish to eat them. And the trouble with urchin barrens is they basically replace kelp, because the urchins are vociferous consumers of kelp. And so we're now at the stage, I don't have a time series for kelp, but we do know that there's there's around 40% more barrens than there is kelp now in Sydney. So there's 20% of our photoquadrates have kelp in them, 27% are barrens. So we're seeing declines in habitat, as well as growth in barrens. Those two are related. On the commercial side, you know, can we afford to have marine protected areas? A study that's just come out by Waldron has looked at the cost versus the economic benefit of marine protected areas, and they basically conclude that the benefits of marine protected areas outweigh the cost by a ratio of about 5 to 1. And that's because there's an uplift in tourism, ecosystem services, all the things that nature does for us is basically ecosystem services, and also mitigating the effects of climate change, particularly if you have reserves in places like estuaries where they can suppress the effects of rising sea levels. Currently, 22 nations have committed to the target of 30% by 2030. That's not Australia. And so finally, in conclusion, we've talked really about three big pressures: tropicalisation, heavy fishing pressure, and loss of habitat. We know what needs to be done. The science is fairly clear on this. We need to get our CO2 emissions down. We need more fully protected areas, and we need better water quality. To me, the question isn't, is the science clear? The question is, do we have the appetite to do the things that need to be done? So that's it from me.
Well, thank you very much, John, for that presentation. That was really, really great. We've had a couple of questions that have come through, but not many. So I would encourage participants for you to actually ask some questions of John, put them into the Q&A session, and at the end of the sessions, we'll be able to look at some of those questions and put them to John in relation to his presentation. So I'd now like to move on to our next panellist, which is Gary Schoer, who's the Secretary of our Southern Sydney branch of the NPA and is also a State Councillor for NPA. Gary's a retired biology teacher with a strong interest in environmental education of community and government MPs and officials alike, and he's been a great campaigner. He's been a supporter of NPA's marine campaigns for over 25 years and will be talking about the many creative ways he's engaged in NPA's advocacy campaigns over the years. So I'd like to welcome Gary to the session, and thank you, Gary, for your presentation tonight.
I'll just share the screen, okay, and put that on there. There we are. Okay, well, look, thank you very much, and welcome to everyone. In answer to John's question about whether we have the appetite to do something about it, well, there are 6 people around the table, and me at least, who over the last 26 years have been doing lots of things, as well as thousands of other people. We know that people are on side, as John's statistics showed there. Around that table, there are members from Royal National Park, Friends of Royal National Park. There's a lady there, Joy, who loves doing stalls for National Parks Association. We've got a couple of senior people from the Sutherland Environment Centre, and a couple of people on the far right poring over a map of Port Hacking, which was part of NPA's original proposal for a marine park off Royal National Park that has now expanded to a much greater area over the total bio area in the Greater Sydney area. So first step, a toolbox of campaigning ideas. Get your allies around you. You can't do this by yourself. As Graham has said, I've been at it for 25 years. You've got to pace yourself. You've got to use your allies. Let's just get this on here. Okay. Yes, look, little cartoon there that basically alludes to the high stakes of what we're involved in, and some people don't like groups such as ours. But even though we have moral high ground, and even the scientific high ground, as John has clearly laid out, victory needs so much more. And what you're going to see tonight is just a small sample of strategies that we have used in cooperation with many other groups. I'm not taking any major credit for any of these things myself, because it couldn't have happened without a massive movement. Yeah, let's just see some of the things that have worked to a point. Okay, think of more than one user group. I mean, it's not just greenies, conservationists, and people who love the ocean. It's people who are swimmers, and some of our best allies have been from ocean swimming groups who not only look at the animals that they see while they're swimming, they record them in citizen scientist sites such as iNaturalista. Fishers, we know many people pushing for marine parks around New South Wales have always got allies on board who are fisher persons, anglers, who are prepared to stand up and be counted. We know that 90% of them are on side. So all the negatives you hear about how it's going to stop your son or daughter from fishing, having a marine park, is just that angst is just not shared by the vast majority of people. So we embrace those people who are clear about what fishing what marine parks will do for the fishing fraternity. Divers are our greatest supporters. Boating, let's include whale watching and that sort of thing, because there's a massive economic gain from all of those sorts of things. Beach life, look, one of the best advocates for the marine world, especially for pollution issues, has been the Spiders Foundation. And groups such as ours need to embrace those sort of groups even more. So you need to enunciate your values and goals. You just can't go off blind and shoot from the hip. So this was a stall at Manly at an Ocean Care Day, which is held yearly. And the big message from the NPA poster here is protecting our oceans for future generations. We've also used terms such as fish for the future, which include, if you think about it, recreation, advantages for recreational and commercial fishers, but especially biodiversity improvements, especially, as John mentioned, those larger fish like sharks and the like. We've used when we first kicked off the campaign for Sydney Marine Park, we used the phrase towards a healthy ocean. We need to be inclusive. We don't want to fight with those people on the edges of the opinion spectrum who think that marine parks are the worst things ever. Towards a healthy ocean implies, yeah, we support that there should be less pollution in the oceans. We support restoring habitats, and we support the recovery of biodiversity. But it's not all about pollution, which people on the fringe of the opinion, particularly of fishers who say these are no good, say that the solution is all in stopping the pollution going into the ocean. No, we are much more holistic than that. And we certainly have to embrace the great science that says that an integral part of that protection is to get substantive sanctuary zones. Now, you're in for the long haul, or you may be. You know, if the stars don't align with the politicians and the bureaucrats, know that it may take quite a number of years. I've been involved, as Graham said, for about 25 years in this issue, very strongly involved in the last 5 years, helping to write multiple submissions on behalf of NPA and trying to get people around us running seminars all over the coast. So get out and have fun. I'm pointing out to the photographer there that there are lots of little fish in amongst the seagrass at Bonnie Vale, down near Bundina, where there's a nursery zone, and that has gone into the proposal for part of the Sydney Marine Park. And the government actually accepted this one. There's a sanctuary theoretically agreed to by government, or waiting for the community to comment on it. I'll have more to say about that later. Iconic places can be the heart of a campaign. This is Eagle Rock. We've used this to draw in the people who mainly recreate on the land, because you may well be landlubbers who like to know that everything's being cared for out there. This campaign started 26 years ago or so, when there was a threat to do sand mining, underwater sand mining off Royal National Park. So we rallied people around us. We paid a geographer to do a study, and we got the first draft of Sydney Marine Park off Royal National Park, centred around this iconic Eagle Rock in Royal National Park. And Citizen John has talked about Reef Life Survey and the great results he's got from there. This is a part of an underwater photo fish ID for a group called Harbour Keepers, who surveyed certain fish varieties around Sydney Harbour, paid for by environmental trusts and the like. So NPA for many years had young people and older people actually getting really involved, sticking their head below the water. So look for funding sources, be innovative to get people involved in the real world. And some of our biggest allies are divers, particularly those divers who can photograph beautiful spots like this, the Barren Hut off Royal National Park. These are sponge gardens and marine tulips. I just love this picture when I saw it. I follow all these sort of posts by divers on Facebook, and I asked the photographer if I could use this. So thank you, Mike Scotland, for this photograph. And maybe, you know, the fact that people can't poke their heads under the water, the power of good photographs might help to have the same sort of impact that this one had to help save the Franklin. You may not quite get to Rock Island Bend in the middle of the Franklin River, but that photograph was on posters that went right around the world, and it gave the Franklin some recognition, even though some people will never ever get there. Now, it takes a lot of effort to get involved in major events to spread the word, so use the opportunity to barge into other people's parades and events. This is a big Ocean Care Day parade going to a display of lots of stalls at Manly, strongly supported by the Manly Environment Centre. NPA supplied those core flute signs, and we support a Sydney Marine Park. Yeah, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Be smart to save your energy. Believe me, if you think that you're going to do all of this yourself and be the guru on it all without tapping into the passion that is clearly there in groups such as the Manly Environment Centre, well, you're not using your resources effectively enough. And always try to create an ocean caring culture, no matter where your issue is. The Friends of Cabbage Tree Bay, which has a small but very effective aquatic reserve near Manly. It's got people who look out for the place, who contact fisheries if someone's illegally fishing there. They educate people about what it's like to either swim there or snorkel or dive. They're on Facebook. So they're creating this culture. They're supporting the economy of people who have shops around the area. So yeah, get that caring thing going rather than the necessarily the oppositional thing that can actually sap your energy. Work to get major stakeholder groups on the side. We've got people there from the council, Manly Council. We've got the Sydney Coastal Councils group on side. This Aboriginal person, of course, for the Ocean Care Day at Manly, and a big conference that NPA ran at the Bondi Pavilion that John was at. And John got a great scientist from Tasmania to come up and give the keynote address. We also got a professor from Newcastle Uni who was Aboriginal to do the welcome to country and summarised what Sydney Harbour might have been like before white people came. So yeah, stakeholder groups. And anyone else who expresses any interest at all in helping, embrace them. Don't just let it go, because these are the people you will need for the long haul. We've been very successful getting a couple of local Liberal MPs very much on side with our Sydney Marine Park concept. This is Mark Curry from Oatley, who was quite happy to have his photograph taken and then put into Facebook. So this is a guy who will write letters to the ministers, the relevant ministers. Same with Mark Speakman. Before he was a minister, he wrote to the Minister for Environment at the time, encouraging him to announce a Sydney Marine Park at the 2014 World Parks Congress. Needless to say, he didn't. But nevertheless, Mark Speakman took the time to do that. So embrace those politicians, ask if they're prepared to stand up publicly. These stalls that we run in different places need to educate and promote action. So, for example, I want to point out some of the resources here. NPA produced all of these, the big poster with the turtle on it. You can see a poster down the bottom left-hand side that says Marine Sanctuaries. It's got photographs donated by divers and the summaries, just like John has given, of the values of marine sanctuaries and what some of the science is. So NPA can actually tap into the electronic version of a lot of this stuff, so don't hesitate to ask. At this same door, we had a whole pile of postcards with beautiful marine scenes on them. And these were collected, these were signed off by people who had messages on them for their local MP. Then we sent off thousands of these to local MPs, encouraging them to do something about getting some sanctuaries together for Sydney. We even ran a parallel marine event to the World Parks Congress at the Bondi Pavilion. Sorry, we've cut off the former CEO of NPA there, but we called it Celebrating Sydney's Marine Environment from Research to Action. So there's another big idea. Let's get the science together and put it into action. We also ran an excursion, an intertidal excursion down around the Bondi area, which was in the electorate of a very supportive Liberal MP. Not Lee Jones, I think his name was. So yeah, a lot of effort, but we had a lot of people cooperating on that. In any campaign, I like to adopt a principle of adult learning, that adult people have choices. So find your niche in the campaign, encourage other people to adopt a niche that they feel comfortable in, they feel competent in, and that they've got time to do. And so we got together scientists, John Turnbull and other marine scientists, and myself, and a GIS specialist who was a retired geography teacher, got together our combined skills to produce this electronic submission on Google Earth to present to government. This is after 5 years of consultation getting to this stage, and we thought we were getting close to having a Sydney Marine Park. On this particular document, we use the technique of being able to click on these red bits will show why the sanctuaries are important there. The blue bits talk about specific known values of that area. And so that's the way we use to communicate to politicians. We also took this map along to the bureaucrats within OEH, the Office of Environment and Heritage, and lo and behold, some of our draft proposals appeared in what the government's draft proposals were. So we think we had a pretty good impact on that, even though the net result has been negative, I'm afraid. And this is, if you click on one of the blue dots in Port Hacking, you'll come across this. So I won't play any more of that, but suffice it to say that that very rare discovery of the swimming anemone in that area in Port Hacking was recorded on iNaturalista. It was recorded on our submission. This is spread amongst all the swimmers in the area to increase their interest in not just swimming, but in conservation of the area. And this map here was presented to government in this format. For example, you can see Boat Harbour Sanctuary. You can see the expanded size of the sanctuary that we have proposed, and within it you can see a much smaller reserve of which there was no real sanctuary. So what the government actually did was added little bits and pieces of sanctuary to some existing aquatic reserves, but their ultimate proposal only suggested 2.4% sanctuaries in the Greater Sydney Marine region, which, as John said, is not enough to do anything much at all. And our friend John Turnbull also was quite happy to do a op-ed or an article, unsolicited article on the values of Botany Bay. And so this was the method that we chose to communicate the values of Botany Bay to the general public. And it doesn't matter if there's no advances in the conservation outcomes as all this is going on. The point is to keep the public interested in the colour and the beauty and the value of these places, so it never goes out of their mind. The local paper, it should never go out of their mind that they're a caring people for the oceans. And when in fact the government did announce their draft marine park with 2.4% sanctuary, that's the way the Leader newspaper responded to it. our marine park. And there's someone looking over part of Tara Point where thankfully there were going to be some increased sanctuary zones. So that sense of ownership and getting the local media on side is something that we need to do as a community to make sure that that's front and centre of their thinking. And when the proposals were put out by government, despite 5 years of angst getting to this stage and multiple submissions and meetings, there was Notley Smith, second from left, the local member at Coogee, the Minister for Environment, of course the Premier, and on the right, Neil Blair, the then Minister for Fisheries, who does have control over the management of marine parks now, having taken it away from environment, but jointly between environment and fisheries, it is their joint roles to establish marine parks. Now we're waiting for 6 weeks to give feedback to their proposals, and sometime, some short time after that, Neil Blair encouraged the government to remove any consideration of any of those 2.4% of sanctuaries for as part of Sydney Marine Park. They sort of hinted that the marine park might go ahead, but not with sanctuaries. Hey, you know, John, the question is, are we serious about the place of marine parks in the reserve network? Well, we are, but I'm afraid the stars are not aligning at the moment, and our political masters in the state government are not with us, I'm afraid.
Well, thanks.
So it looks like we need to take steps forward. How can you help? How can we help you? Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Gary. That's fantastic. Thank you. So not many people have been asking very many questions of Gary, so I'd encourage you to do so. And just to let you know, we've got 82 participants here tonight, so that's a really great turn up that we've got here for tonight. So I'd now like to hand over to Sharnie Connell. Sharnie is our Senior Campaigns Officer here at the NPA, and she'll be talking about the emerging threats to our New South Wales network of marine protected areas and what we plan to actually do to address these threats. So again, if you could ask questions, first of all of Gary, if you've got any, and then while Sharnie's talking, if you've got any questions of Sharnie, please feel free to ask those questions so that we can compile them to the end. Thank you, Sharnie. If you can just take over.
Great. I think I've taken over. Thanks so much, Graham. And thank you too, Gary. It's really good to see all the different strategies you've employed over the years to try and advocate for our marine environment. So yeah, it's a pretty tough gig, this whole environmental conservation thing. Yeah, so anyway, we're doing the best we can with what we've got right now. So anyway, I'm just going to jump over to my presentation. So I'll click the share screen button. And is this working? Alrighty, how's that? So I'm screen sharing, yep. Okay, good stuff. Alrighty, so I'd just like to familiarise you guys with the marine protected areas we have across New South Wales first. So, I mean, obviously a lot of you guys are probably very familiar with the national parks that we have in New South Wales, but potentially not so familiar with what we have in terms of marine parks and other marine protected areas. So marine protected areas is an umbrella term that actually, you know, things that come under marine parks, aquatic reserves, marine national parks, and sanctuary zones. Now, a marine park and a national park are not the same. So when John talks about sanctuary zones, that's what we would consider the same level of protection as what we would have in a national park in New South Wales. That's where you can't take anything away, and you can't go in there and do any hunting or killing or logging or grazing and things like that. So just see on this map, this is our marine parks in New South Wales. So we have 5 coastal marine parks. Starting at the top near the Queensland border, we have the Cape Byron Marine Park. Just a little bit further south, we have the Solitary Islands Marine Park in Coffs Harbour. Then we have the Port Stephens Great Lake Marine Park, just north of Newcastle. We have this area in the middle called the Hawkesbury Shelf bioregion. That's around the Sydney area. And I'll just get back to that in a second. So that's the inset. So just hold that for a moment. We also have the Jervis Bay Marine Park, just south of Wollongong. And we have the Batemans Marine Park. Now, if you have a look at the size of the marine parks on the map, so if you think about how big they are in comparison to sort of the coastline there, it's not that all of that area is sanctuary, it's that a very small proportion of that area is zoned sanctuary. And that's the bit that we really care about. When John talks about in his research that partially protected areas don't really do much. So really we're looking at the sanctuary zones as the only really important bit for our marine protected areas, and they're the bit we advocate for in our marine parks. Now in the central inset section there, we have the region between Wollongong and Newcastle. So this was obviously the area where we were centred around running the Sydney Marine Park campaign. And there were a bunch of identified sites. And now in that area, in that inset in red, we have 10 aquatic reserves. So unfortunately, most of those aquatic reserves are actually partially protected, and there's only a couple such as Cabbage Tree Bay and Shiprock and Tower Point that are actually sanctuary zones. And they're very small. So Cabbage Tree Bay, we're looking at 20 hectares, which is absolutely tiny. And Shiprock, we're looking at 2 hectares. So when you think in terms of that, our marine protection in sanctuary zones, that's the important part, is really quite minimal. Okay, so just jumping across to the next slide. Okay, so we had a bit of a hit historically to our sanctuary zones. Back in around 2014, we had this thing called the Headlands and Beaches Assessment. And so this was under the Baird government that actually 30 sanctuaries, just overnight, suddenly the government said, you can now fish in these 30 sanctuaries, basically undoing probably, at least 15 years of, actual conservation work overnight. So it takes a long time for sanctuary zones to actually recover and breed, and for the animals and the habitat to regrow and build itself back up. It takes a very long time. So if you open those areas up to fishing, you're basically destroying all those conservation gains very, very quickly. So there was a very big concerted campaign during that time. And you can see from this, this table that I've got here, up the top, this shows we actually lost 10 sanctuaries forever. Well, not forever, but under that process. So out of the 30 that were taken away, we lost 10, but we managed to get 20 back. And they're the 20 that are down the bottom. But sadly, as I said, once you open these sanctuaries up to recreational fishing, pretty soon it's just going to impact it, and it will go back down to being, back to pre-fishing sort of levels of biodiversity and biomass. All right, so now this is actually probably would be my favorite beach. This is one of the sanctuaries that was part of the Headlands and Beaches Assessment. This is one of the sanctuaries that we actually won back. Now, if you look at these amazing geographical rock formations, this is a place called Gorilla Bay in the Batemans Marine Park. It is absolutely stunning. To the left side of this photo, there's a couple of really deep holes that you actually can't see. But when you stick your head under the water here, it's like a labyrinth of just amazing formations to dive and swim around. But there's absolutely hardly any marine life whatsoever. So despite the fact that this is now a sanctuary, because it was opened up, there's virtually nothing left, and that now has to take another 15 years to rebuild, which is pretty devastating. Okay, so this is actually a shot of the Port Stephens Great Lakes Marine Park. So the shot up on the right you can see a place called Halifax Point or Fly Point in the Nelson Bay area. So it's obviously, it's really hard for people to understand the need for marine protection. You know, people look out on the water, they see sand, they see rocky shores, they see water, vegetation. It looks great. But it's when you stick your head underneath the water, that's when you can see the difference. Now, this particular place is completely different to Gorilla Bay. When you stick your head under the water here, this is a sanctuary zone, and it is completely full of life. It's got these wonderful sea tulips, these wonderful sponge gardens, and as you can see, there's plenty of fish swimming in and around that reef. Absolutely spectacular marine life we have, if only we could protect it better. All right, so just jumping into the Batemans area, more specifically. Now, when you look at this is a marine park zoning map. Now, the only part that we're most interested in is the sanctuary zones. They are coloured in pink. Now, it looks like there's a lot of pink on the page, so I just want you to sort of, for a minute, sort of think, don't worry about all the stuff, all the insets, because they're all getting into more detail. But if you just look at the general map, you can sort of see there's pink zones, there's the yellow zones, so they're recreational fishing zones, and then there's light blue zones. So the light blue zones are where they actually have some sort of commercial fishing. So this is our marine park at Batemans, and it allows commercial fishing in it. So that, to me, you know, and probably to you too, would sort of give you a sense of how much protection that would actually afford. So the bit we are really interested in are the pink bits. Now, if you look at the next slide, you can see what we just had most recently taken away. Unfortunately, just before Christmas, the Agriculture Minister announced that they would be opening up some marine sanctuaries to recreational fishing. And this was just before, well, the fires were an issue, and then COVID's since become an issue. So we're engaging with this campaign now that people are starting to be able to come out and get involved in this. So we lost, and when you look at this map, it's actually pretty disturbing. If you look at all the estuarine areas along the map on the very left-hand side, they've basically taken most of this. There's not much sanctuary left in estuarine areas after this rollback of sanctuaries and allowing rec fishing in the sanctuaries. And then we have this really important offshore island called Montague, which is actually an IUCN green listed site. Surrounding that island in the waters, we have our critically endangered grey nose sharks. So there's an aggregation site there, and it's a really important area for them. So we shouldn't be opening these places up to fishing, particularly when we've got critically endangered species that can be impacted by that fishing. Alrighty, so just got some pretty pictures of animals just to break it up a little bit. So yeah, these are the sorts of animals you can see up in the Cape Barren Marine Park, usually around summer. Got a manta ray and a leopard shark. We've got our critically endangered grey nurse sharks on the left, very popular, and we've got our green turtle up on the right. You can see these throughout the entire New South Wales marine coastal environment. We've got our giant cuttlefish down on the left. Interesting story about those guys. They have a massive aggregation, thousands of them every year in South Australia in a sanctuary zone in Whyalla. Now they've just opened that up to fishing, and all the tourism operators were disgusted to find that pretty much all of these thousands and thousands of giant cuttlefish have just been fished out, and that's just impacted the tourism. So this is why it's really important to have areas set aside for protection. We also have our little penguins. Back in the Sydney Marine Park campaign, we were hoping to get more protection for them. The last mainland colony of little penguins is actually in Manly, and that's for the whole of New South Wales. And then Batemans, this is a picture from Montague Island on the left. So this is, you can actually swim and snorkel with the seals that they have there. There's a New Zealand fur seal population and an Australian fur seal population that are there. And before you go off on the boat to get out to Montague Island, you can often see the big smooth rays that are hanging around the wharf there near the fish cleaning tables. So they're really, really popular. So there's amazing animals and habitats and amazing marine life that we need to save. There's our big blue groper, very, very friendly and popular with divers and snorkelers, and the weedy sea dragon. So we see these guys throughout New South Wales. So just, sorry, I'll stop the share for a minute and just to come back on. So yeah, we basically know that fairly soon we're going to be in a consultation around the Batemans Marine Park sanctuaries. And so we need as many people and as many supporters to get involved in this campaign to try to save our Batemans sanctuaries. We're hoping through this process of consultation, we can actually get back the sanctuaries that were taken just before Christmas and opened up to fishing. And we're hoping that we can stop this rollback of sanctuaries throughout our coastal marine parks. And this is the trend that is sort of happening with this current government. So we need to put a lot of pressure on the government to move in the opposite direction. The Agriculture Minister has actually stated that he wishes to not only open up the Batemans Marine Parks sanctuaries, but the next step is the Port Stephens and Great Lakes Marine Park. So this is very, very concerning information. So I've got a little quiz on there, a little poll to see who would be interested to get involved in a range of activities. There's lots of things that we will be asking you to do. We'll be emailing you, we'll be putting up requests on social media and trying to get lots of volunteers and members on board with this campaign, advocating for the protection of our marine life and our sanctuaries as much as we possibly can. So yeah, this is just the beginning, and feel free to contact us to fill in the poll and to get involved in this campaign. It's going to be really good. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharnie, and thank you to all of our panellists for their presentations today. I've just wanted to sort of ask people if they can just keep going with their questions for a little bit, but I think we've just about full up in relation to those questions. I've got a question from Nigel, and I thought I might put it to Sharnie in the first instance, and others may want to add if they want to. But Sharnie, one of the questions that's been asked is, what are the criteria that we use for designating a marine park or a marine sanctuary, and how are they different?
The criteria. I guess what normally happens when they establish a marine park is that the government usually says, okay, this is the total area that will be the marine park, and then they have a consultation process with stakeholders, and where they should also include the science to kind of work out what areas have the most ecological value and need, you know, what threatened species are there, what habitats do we need to protect, and then sort of overlay that with the social values and try and come out with something that, you know, puts the sanctuaries in a really good area for protection, but then allows people to actually still utilize the marine environment and go fishing, for instance, in other areas. So yeah, generally it's a process of consultation with the government and the people and the stakeholders involved to get that outcome. But in the last few years, the outcomes, even though we're engaging with the process, they haven't been very good outcomes as far as we're concerned. Yeah.
So John, I'm just wondering from a scientific point of view, whether you've got some thoughts about what the criteria could or should be in relation to marine areas, marine parks.
Yes, when the scientists look at this question, they use software, breaks up the area to be considered into a grid and looks at the features and characteristics. And so really from a scientist's viewpoint, you try to protect as many species and functional groups as you can. And so it really is about representative areas. So I see some other questions there about should marine areas be coastal or oceanic? The answer is you're really trying to get coverage across all of those. And so, for example, seamounts, which are deep water, you want to make sure you protect those because that's where, say, the orange roughy live. You don't want to just in preference just say, well, let's put the reserves out to sea where no one's going to care because it won't affect their lifestyles in terms of, say, fishing activities. The trouble with that, of course, is a lot of species need the shallow waters and come and go from the shallow waters to the deeper waters. So unless you're covering a representative mix of habitats and populations, you might have one area which is you're allowed to fish in, but that might have a big impact on other areas because we don't have fences in the ocean.
Yeah, so I guess there's a follow-up question, John, that comes to mind, and that is, what do you think is the effective size? We've been asked a number of questions from Gary and Judy and others about, you know, what sort of size should a marine park be, and I guess, you know, the extent to which that's achievable.
Well, I love this question because it was actually the focus of an entire study that was that I was involved in the region. And look, the general consensus among scientists is the bigger the better. And the reason for that is if you've got wide-ranging species, you know, big species, sharks, for example, they range over huge areas. And so the more of their range you can protect, the better. The smaller you get with a protected area, the more you need to do to make it work is the answer in our research. So we looked at the aquatic reserves in Sydney, and Shiprock and Cabbage Tree Bay are tiny, but actually they have higher biodiversity and higher biomass than areas that aren't fully protected. So even those two small reserves do something. But the thing is, with a small reserve, there are a couple of other things you have to do. First of all, you have to put it in a really good location. So if you've got a really big reserve, it covers lots of different bays and nooks and crannies and different types of habitat. The location of it is less important than if you're putting a small reserve in. You have to really pick a good spot. It's got to be very complex habitat and sheltered so that fish will recruit to the area. No good putting it out on the headland that gets smashed by waves. It's not going to do anything. So locating it is really important with a small reserve. And the other thing is, as you see with the Friends of Cabbage Tree Bay, putting it in a place where the local community will help enforce it, basically help reinforce its value, is really important. So that's why Cabbage Tree Bay works, because it's sheltered, it's complex habitat, but also it has a local community group that just loves it. And you'd be a brave person to break the rules in Cabbage Tree Bay.
Thank you, John. So I've got a question really for Gary. And Gary, one of the things that Bob's asked us is, do any of the political parties currently have a policy platform that includes marine parks? You have to unmute, buddy.
Yeah, at last year's NPA annual dinner, the Minister for Environment, Matt Keane, actually said to me that his government, or he personally, regards Sydney Marine Park future as one of his most important activities for the beginning of this year. Well, of course, COVID has gone into that, but we know he's got the values, but he needs to demonstrate the values by seeing if he can get through the National Party sort of barrier, shooters and fishers, of course. So there's a lot of political games and second guessing as to how to do this politically. Look, Labor came out before the last election and said very positive things about, yes, we support a Sydney Marine Park, etc. But when their minister or shadow minister was interviewed by I think it was the leader of the opposition, was interviewed by Fishing News, their answer sounded much like what the Liberal fishing minister would have said to them. So they're very pragmatic, both political parties. We've had promises from Labor Party, from Liberal Party over the last many years that a Sydney Marine Park is on the agenda. So I think the secret is to try to push for bipartisan support. Look, the science is so clear, but hey, the next step is this, this determination to actually do something about it and to cooperate with one another to make sure we can implement marine parks that work, because the sham that came out in the draft from the Liberal Party just recently went nowhere towards that goal.
Okay, so I guess I've got a different tack to think about now, and I might talk to you, John, initially about this in terms of the science, and I guess the catchment into the oceans, the horticultural practices, use, urban development, all these disturbance factors and threats, and I guess the question is, what do you think are the sort of priorities of areas for protection? Is it solely about marine, parks issues? Is it climate change? Is it overfishing? What sort of, things and priorities do we need to think about when we're talking about managing and protecting marine parks?
This is always a big topic of debate, because how do you judge which pressure is bigger? And for example, there's a big difference between historical priorities and future. So historically, overfishing has been the biggest impact globally out of all the ones you just listed there. And there's a paper by Duarte et al., which makes that very clear. But into the future, I think climate change is going to start to dominate. What I would say is it's not an either or. Basically, marine organisms suffer most when they're under multiple stressors. So, a bit of fishing pressure, but clean water, not warming oceans, good habitat, you might be fine. You now add a bit of pollution on top of that, which might then reduce the recruitment success, or might kill larvae more than, say, adults, and you get a bit more impact. And so when you have multiple stressors, poor water quality coming from runoff, rising acidity, fishing pressure, habitat loss, the combination of those is what really smashes marine life. And so I would say we shouldn't be thinking which one should we tackle. I would say we need to have strategies to tackle all of them. We're a technologically advanced society. We're a wealthy society here in Australia. We can afford to do a good job of protecting our natural assets. And I think we should be tackling all of those.
All right, well, we've got only a couple of more questions to go, and I'd welcome if people can just hang around for a little bit longer. So we've got a question that's about overfishing, and also the issue about ghost nets and whether we're seeing debris from fishing activities. And Sharnie, you're in the depths of all this. Do you observe, fishing and netting and other debris in the ocean, and how do you see that?
I'm personally observing it, not that often. I did see a net in Thailand actually, which was shocking, and was over a reef, and we had to work out the GPS and identify it and let people know about it. But no, ghost netting is a massive issue. It's referred to as a serial killer, really, because what it does is it just continues to kill things, and then they rot away, and then it goes on to kill other things, and the animals that are in the ghost nets are actually attracting other animals to come and predate on that, and so it's just a disaster. But there's certain areas where those nets are actually picked up by various currents and things, and they're more prevalent in certain areas. I know Northern Territory is a really bad hotspot for ghost nets, but it's absolutely shocking. We need to be trying to reduce the impact that different fishing methods have on our marine environment, and ghost netting is a massive issue, and I believe that it's because it's actually, I think they throw the nets overboard so that they can fill up with fish, and that's quite disturbing if that's the way it is.
Thanks for that, Sharnie. And I've got a last question, I think, for tonight. And I guess one of the things that people have been asking, and Hushies wanted to talk to John about this question, and that is, when you say fishing pressure, is it commercial fishing, is it recreational fishing, or is it a combination of both? How do you see the mix in terms of marine parks and the pressures for fishing in those areas?
Yes, well, on this topic, once again, the science and the conservation literature is quite clear that there is no place for industrial scale removal of biomass in a marine protected area. So that's the first thing. That's a global statement. I think it's IUCN, make it very clear, if you're going to call it a protected area, you shouldn't be doing any sort of industrial scale extraction, so commercial fishing. But it would be a mistake to then assume that if you take commercial fishing out, which we don't do, so our marine parks are all open to commercial fishing in some way. If you take that, it would be a mistake to think if you take that out, you're set. It depends on the species, but if you look at catch, so biomass being extracted, some species have a higher catch amongst recreational fishing in New South Wales than commercial. So once again, unfortunately, the answer is you need to remove or reduce both commercial and recreational fishing pressures. A very small amount of fishing can have a major effect on a population because we extract the big fish preferentially, and they're the big breeders. Right? A big fish puts a lot more energy into spawning and egg production and sperm production than a small fish. And so a small amount, and that's why the opening up even of the shorelines in sanctuary zones is a real concern, because that small strip will have a massive effect on the fish populations in the whole reserve, because we're very efficient at finding fish and catching fish, and we pull the big ones out first. So the short answer to all of that is you need to reduce both those pressures.
Well, thank you very much, John, and thank you, Sharnie, and thank you, Gary, for your presentations and discussions tonight. I hope people have found it very helpful and very useful for us. This session is really the first of a series that we're hoping to run. If we'd like to get feedback, so if you've got your chat there and you would like to give us feedback about topics that you think we could run as a future sort of session like this, we'd certainly welcome that sort of recommendations and that sort of advice. So I also would just like to ask everybody, get involved with NPA if you're not involved already, and we would certainly welcome any support for our marine and other conservation programs. So thank you, everybody. Have a good evening and take care. Thank you.